This definitely isn't the third take of this. Guild mechanics are fascinating. Magic the Gathering has done 3 major visits to the plane of Ravnica, which is defined by 10 guilds. Traditional visits to Ravnica involve showing the 10 guilds, and each time, each guild gets a keyword mechanic on its cards to define it doing its thing in a play environment. It's a lot more mechanics than you normally see in a set, and those mechanics are usually explored in an even way. They try to make sure everyone gets something and it's all worth having. There are at this point 29 keyword mechanics for the 10 guilds of Ravnica. That's a list, and we can order lists. And I like ordering lists, and I like talking about magic cards. So let's do that. There's some upfront parameters for how I'm going to talk about this. A guild mechanic should ideally have the following traits: guild identity, high impact, and low breadth. Now let's unpack that a bit. Guild identity is the way that the mechanic expresses the ideology of not just the colors, but of this guild specifically. Not every blue-black faction is the Dimir House. Silumgar's brood is blue-black dragons, but they're big and inexorable, and they're prone to thievery, which doesn't necessarily feel like the House of Shadows, who are sneaky and conniving and inclined towards secrets. While every color pairing is going to have things in common because of a shared color identity, the guilds of Ravnica have very specific identities that relate to their mechanical needs. Impact is a generalized, deliberately vague term for the juice and how much worth the squeeze it is. A mechanic that's hard to make happen and doesn't do much is pretty low impact. This isn't the same thing as power. It's very possible for a mediocre mechanic to be very powerful just based on price. Impact can be best asked with, would I bother, when you imagine the effect? What kinds of changes does this make on your deck to get you to use it? Is it an effect you want rarely or all the time? Is this a mechanic you want a lot of in your deck? Knowing that these are meant to be the mechanics of guilds, of organizations, does having this mechanic in your deck make you want to have that deck be representative of that guild? Finally, breadth is the question of how much space a card needs. Not space on the card. That's kind of a solved problem at this point, and you should be making your custom cards with at most 9 lines of text on them. But rather, the volume of cards in the set. Sometimes mechanics need to appear alongside things that make that mechanic worth having. So, creature combat keywords are useful in a set where you know creatures are going to get into a lot of combat. A mechanic like Flashback can be enabled with cards that mill you, for example, or reward you for casting sorceries in instants, and maybe a longer, slower game will reward you with the chances to use Flashback. So a mechanic doesn't just exist on its own on a certain number of cards. You need to make sure it's worth using and that it interacts properly within that space. So too much breadth and you wind up with a mechanic that needs a lot of cards to be expressed. Too little breadth and you don't have enough mechanical space to make the cards you need. Also, Wizards, this isn't going to feature new or original card designs. I'm just going to talk about these designs from my own examination of the mechanics agnostically. You are safe to watch this, and you can offer me a remote work job. I'm extremely cool, I promise. Also, this list is mostly just a bunch of mechanics that are pretty even in their overall quality, with only a wild dip at the front and a huge jump at the end. So a lot of these are going to be kind of boring and just competent. But don't worry, we've got some stinkers to start with. Radiance. Mark Rosewater considers this to be one of the 20 worst mechanics of all time. The guild identity for this is non-existent. The Boros Legion, I guess there's a good joke here about how the Boros Legion is a aggregate of violent cops and they really care about what color you are, but I don't think that's intentional, and in hindsight, it's a bit yikes. Impact-wise, it's terrible because this mechanic is out of your control. In fact, the correct number of Radiance cards in your deck is 0, because if your opponent is playing anything that matches your colors, and you're encouraged to play at least 2, then improving your side of the board might improve their side of the board at the same time. It is a horrendous idea, and it feels like an absolute afterthought. I'm sure it was play tested and had a lot of good play experiences, but you wouldn't make a Radiance deck You wouldn't make a Radiance deck that valued anything. And the worst part is they barely made enough Radiance cards to make half a deck. This thing has no breadth. It's a bit of a dud mechanic, and every card they made with it, they kind of overcosted, which is a good sign that it's not a mechanic they want to encourage you to use. This is one of the truly magnificent failures of original Ravnica, and the funniest part of it is red-white was really strong at that period, but no one ever used Radiance. Undergrowth. So I'm going to say some things about this mechanic, hurtful things, but I want you to understand, it's not because this mechanic effect is bad. The problem is this mechanic has no guild identity. The Golgari do not uniquely own this. This does not express Golgari. And you know that because you can go to Scryfall and search for the phrase each creature card in your graveyard and find that they've been printing cards with that for years before the Golgari existed, and they've printed it every time that we haven't been in Ravnica. There's a card with this text in Foundations, and I don't think anyone would go, a secret Undergrowth cameo. It's hard to say about the impact of this because these are just generic cards. They didn't really care about having more of them. The ones of them that weren't creatures worked against your Undergrowth, but also as spells they could get into your graveyard more easily. It's a nothing. It's a whatever of a mechanic. It is an indescribably forgettable mechanic, which kind of makes it one of the other worst mechanics of all time on that list. We did get Lotleth Giant as an example of a high impact presence. People knew about this Undergrowth card, but it was only useful and only had good value in being played because it could just kill your opponent on the spot. Which, by the way, is a terrible thing to make a big chunky 7-mana creature do, because you kind of want to attack with it. Don't worry though, we got Thassa's Oracle 2 years later, and then no one ever needed Lotleth Giant again until they reprinted it as a common, and it could be a problem in Pauper. The breadth of this mechanic is overwhelming. Absolutely catastrophically huge. This is one of the most wide mechanics they've ever made into a guild mechanic, to the point where I don't feel like this guild got a mechanic this year. Haunt. Oh yeah, here's another one of the worst mechanics of all time. Oops. Haunt is a really cool mechanic for the Ortsoff. It has a great flavor. And one of the things I love about it the most is that the card goes to the graveyard and then gets exiled, and that's when it starts haunting, which to me conveys the feeling that the Ortsoff have dealt with the body. The body is not a concern. What is lingering is not material, it's the soul. That's really cool. The problem that follows on from that then is that Haunt has two different mechanical executions, and because it's reliant on triggered abilities and relating to the haunted creature, it's just a lot of space on a card, which limits how interesting any of them can be, and also it means that they both feel really different, and no one likes either of them very much. This is a shame. I still think of Blind Hunter as an absolutely great card. Any place I could play Blind Hunter and it's good, I'm going to be happy with that place to some extent. In breadth-wise, it is broad, but only if you go in those two directions, you're going to wind up having problems. And in fact, I think that the correct thing to do is to instead go color by color. That white haunts do this, black haunts do this. Have black haunts on spells that do negative effects to creatures that they're haunting. Have white one improve them. There's a lot of options there if you just limit the haunt effects to one of the two things. Replicate. Guild identity. It's a solid science word, but also the Izzet are meant to be artificers and artifact people. And for several years, we've got just spellcasting mechanics for them. The impact on Replicate is pretty small because the nature of how they're designed, it tends to be, here is a slightly overpriced spell, you can pump more mana in to make it close to worth it. You wouldn't really play 4 mana sorcery speed, draw 2 cards, but if you had a way of generating infinite mana, you might spend, 25 mana to draw 12 cards. But at that point, what's the actual value of that? It's effectively an ugly X spell. Its interaction with counterspells was also more important back in the day. You could replicate and then remand your own replicate base spell back. That's kind of cute, but that's not rewarding you for having a lot of replicate spells. Not things triggering off replication. And the best replicate card is the Djinn, which lets you do more replicating of spells that don't have it naturally, which kind of tells me that it's more like the effect of copying a spell a lot for the amount of mana you pump into it. That's cool. Replicate cards aren't cool. You can put replicate on everything, including creatures now, and that's an indication that breadth is a problem. It's just generally applicable. It very badly fits the Izzet. I don't like this mechanic at all. Addendum. I think Addendum is an incredible mechanic for expressing the Azorius identity. It's instants and sorcery, so they can be retaliatory and delayed and holding onto your action for as long as possible. But then, when you do execute on them in the sorcery speed way, it has a degree of like, and also, I get this. The impact, I think that these spells felt pretty good when you could get the addendum off them, when you had stabilized enough that you could take the breather of, and now in my main phase I'm going to do a thing. That was usually a feeling like you just pushed the elbow around and you'd taken over the game. You didn't get a lot of redundant addendum effects though. You didn't play lots of them. You usually played the best ones, which is usually just Sphinx's Insight if you're a cheap budget player like me. There aren't a ton of effects you can do with it though, so it's got low breadth. You can't put your classic white destroy and attack a spell on this, and you can't put your classic blue counterspell on this, unless you want to make a counterspell that's only good for defending yourself in your main phase, and therefore probably only going to get used by people storming or comboing off somehow. Yeah. Extort! Okay, so I like Extort again. I feel like I'm going to be praising the Ortsov a lot until I'm suddenly not. Extort is reasonably strong. It's the Ortsov taking something from you, and the only currency you have that they want is your life. It rewards you for having lots of mana, so you want to play a long, slow game, but it also rewards you for having lots of permanents that care about you casting spells, so there's a degree of grindiness and patience and gumming up the board. It's a really good example of the interconnected crime syndicate effect of the Ortsov. There are all these things out there. None of them are particularly individually impressive, but the fact that there are all of them here and they're all working against you means that you have no power. Impact-wise, it's really strong and it's really cool. Players like slow bleeds. They like this feeling of like, I have control and all I need to do is keep control of everything and you will eventually succumb to what I'm doing to you. So this is both a clock for winning the game, it'll kill your opponent, and a way of keeping yourself alive. It feels good, and it wants you to build with a lot of it, so it really encourages you to make a Ortsov deck. The breadth of it is surprisingly narrow. Expensive cards will need more mana pumped into them to trigger the Extort, so you don't tend to want it on big expensive effects. If there's anything big and expensive with Extort, it's got to bring with it something really special, like say doubling your mana or something. But for the most part, Extort wants you to put it on small, cheap cards, which does limit you to mostly permanents, mostly creatures. Not that you can't do it on enchantments. There are definitely some cute ways to do it, especially with our more modern tech of, here is a enchantment with an enter the battlefield effect that's effectively a sorcery, and here is something it has once it arrives. That's cool. I would not mind seeing something like that. Hellbent. So, here we run into a bit of a problem. The guild identity is a big kinda, because when this card was printed, Rakdos wasn't very well defined. They were kind of just a murder cult. And Hellbent does represent No Thought's head empty of that vision of the Rakdos. But also, it doesn't do a lot to, like, collect a feeling. It doesn't convey much of the greater Rakdos vision. Impact-wise, so there is a degree to which sculpting your hand to the point where you can make the Demon Fire the last thing out of your hand that will kill your opponent, and that's very cool. There are very many stories from the Standard era of the time about, hey, Demon Fire you. That was cool whenever you heard about a story that ended with Demon Fire you, but that's kind of the only one. And it doesn't really encourage you to have a lot of these effects because, like, a second Demon Fire in hand won't be uncounterable. But, yeah, it doesn't encourage you to build a guild deck like it, and it encourages you to have a lot of cheap effects that you can throw out to burn them away, which isn't the greatest way to, like, hold that feeling of a guild together. Breadth-wise, you can put Hellbent on anything and make it better when you top deck it. It has a bad reputation, so I think nobody cares. Forecast. This is a fairly weak guild identity. Forecast is definitely a technical word, so it's got that going for it, but it's more of a weather word. It lacks a bureaucratic vibe, and while it does encourage blue-white to play from the hand, a place it doesn't normally get to, it's not being used to do the things that blue-white kind of want to do. The impact of the effect, it's rarely worth having more than one forecast card, and because it's a slow, small effect in your upkeep, and at the time we didn't have Arena, so there was like, you were talking about like you have to do your stops on Magic Online to use this. It meant that the forecast cards tended to be more limited, having one or two of them that were good. I think Sky Hussar and Proclamation of Rebirth are the only ones that I've ever seen people using, and that's a good sign that like an Azorius deck didn't really exist around forecast. The breadth of effects you can put out there is very small, because you need a card to both do a thing and then have a forecast ability that relates to that thing, and then make it so that there is an interesting tension about when you cast it versus when you use it. In the case of Sky Hussar, the thing about its power level is that when it was being played in tournaments, you never cast it. You didn't run it in a deck that could cast it. It existed to let you tap your little white tokens to draw lots of cards in a format where white wasn't getting that kind of effect. I do still love you, Sky Hussar. Adapt. I don't like Adapt. That's going to color this kind of assessment. But still, Guild Identity. This is just +1/+1 counters on green and blue creatures. We see this mechanic all the time. This is an effect that happens everywhere. This is an effect that happened previously in green and blue and had a different name. It's not even vaguely interesting as a mechanic. The impact is it's a perfectly good ability because it gives you a reminder and it gives you a standardized effect. You can make cards that adapt. You can make things that adapt on a trigger. They didn't do that. We didn't get any weird examples of adapt, but still, adapt is an action a creature can take. And it wasn't very good at using that. For the most part, these are just small creatures that get better when you spend mana on them, or big creatures that get less bad when you spend a lot of mana on them. It's a perfectly good drafts thing, and obviously there were 2 tournament level ones of it, but we have this effect now also being explored on Exhaust, and I don't think that Adapt is really worth it anymore. As far as its breadth goes, this took the effect of Monstrous and got rid of everything that made Monstrous interesting. So that conceptual limitation on Monstrous, which it could already go on so many things, being taken away means that Adapt can go anywhere, and in the process there's no reason to put it anywhere. It's too generic now. I do not like it. Unleash. Speaking of things I don't like. Guild identity-wise, tell you what, rename Rakdos Cackler to whatever you want. Take away the keyword Unleash and just spell out the text on the card. Where can't you print that? Where can't you put that creature? Here's a 2/2 that can't block for 1 mana, and it's hybrid red-black. That's just a generic red-black card. And Unleash is a generic red-black effect, and there's nothing linking it to the Rakdos cult, and there's no scaling to it. It's very simple, it's very straightforward. It feels like this had to get made the way it did because they were running out of time or resources. Not to judge anyone who did design it, but the overall effect is that Rakdos this time around kind of only got an effect, sort of. Because the kind of effect you're looking at here is one where you're only not unleashing when you have to block, and if you have to block, you're already losing. That presents an example of a problem. Effectively, it means that all of your cards are 1/1 smaller if you have to block. Boring. That said, I don't think they had enough room for the number of Unleash cards they did. I think that Unleash is an afterthought mechanic. Graft. I think Graft is kind of cool. I don't think it's good. I don't think we should get more of it. But I do think that there is something cool to the idea that the Simic creatures are visibly and tangibly different. All of their cards are these 0/0s that enter with a bunch of counters on them. And That's kind of cool, and then you could hypothetically, certainly in the modern day where we're more okay with passive abilities for this kind of thing, make it so that they all shared abilities. The problem you run into there is like a sort of sliver effect where they become very boring, where it's like, well, the board is now just locked up into these group of mega creatures and there's nothing interesting going on. Making it activated abilities in the original version is kind of probably the best way to do it, just to prevent that kind of cloggy board stall. But still. Impact-wise, it's annoying in digital, and it's very fiddly in physical. And also, it occupies a bunch of space you might want for creatures that don't belong to this faction, that still should have something like this. Like a 0/0 creature that enters with 3+1/+1 counters on it because you're doing other stuff with counters. You can't put that in the set where you're using this. It effectively crowds out that kind of thing. The breadth, you can hypothetically do any creature you want this way, but Graft occupies a lot of space on the card, and it occupies a lot of mental effort for the players engaging with it. So any of the creatures you turn into Graft creatures would have to be pretty simple to start with, and that's not great. Transmute. The guild identity of Transmute is extremely debatable. I think my problem with it is the name. Blue is absolutely a color that transmutes things, changing things from one thing to another, the color transformation. That's fine. That works perfectly. The problem is that black isn't really about transmutation. Black is a lot more of a selfish color. If it wants gold, it's not going to turn lead into gold. It's going to kill you and take your gold. So I don't think the name works, and the name is part of the mechanic. Impact-wise, it was worth having transmute cards around. Transmute cards are good in formats that are tutor hungry, but they make the game more boring and homogenous, and they add more shuffling, so I think that's bad. And they don't encourage you to run them alongside one another unless you have like a hyper-concentrated deck where like everything is 2 mana. And I've got these 2 transmute cards as 4-ofs to go and get a whole bunch of different silver bullets. That's fine, but that doesn't really feel to me like a deck that uses Transmute as much as it is just a tutor package. Also, most of the cards with Transmute were bad because the main thing they were there for was to transmute. The other thing is, breadth-wise, this is a surprisingly narrow mechanic. You kind of have at most like 10 interestingly unique Transmute cards because then you've represented most mana values that anyone cares about. It's a real awkward, wonky mechanic, and I do not like it. Cypher. Guild Identity. I love this. The thing I love the most about this is that the Dimir Guild have this reputation of being sneaky, assassins, and spies. So that means that the creatures of the Dimir, to represent Dimir's vibe, are going to be probably hard to block, probably have some bad effect when they hit you because they're like, you know, investigating or attacking something. And then, in addition to that, they are probably not going to be very big. So you have these small, relentless creatures, and then you can use Cypher to make them do stuff. You can make an engine that will react or lock your opponent down or make things harder for them. And there can be the black attacking your opponent directly or the blue manipulating things to your favor. It's really cool. And because it has these 2 parts to it that don't feed directly into each other, you have a lot of room to do interesting things. The impact of it, I think it feels really good, but also I would think that this is exactly my kind of stuff. This is like a bolted together Voltron, but wide. The breadth of it is surprisingly limited though, because there are only so many things you can put on a blue or black spell that's worth casting during your own turn, regardless of what your opponents are doing. Blue is a really reactive color, and black is a very aggressive color, so the 2 of them together in this case kind of just, you've got slurping life out of your opponents and tapping and messing with your opponent's stuff, and then the obligatory draw a card, or maybe draw a card and lose a life. With Cypher, I will say the addition of stun counters gives us a potentially interesting new addition to things you can do with sorcery speed blue, but at the time, it was a bit narrow. Overload. Guild Identity. Again, the Izzet are supposed to be artificers and manufacturers and gadgeteers, but every time we've seen them outside of Murders at Carl of Mana, they have been focused on spells. The impact of these cards tends to be great. They are sorceries and instants. They tend to relate to the board having stuff on it, and therefore they scale up throughout the course of the game. That can be really exciting and really fun. Breadth You can do a lot with Overload, but I don't think you should. Wording a card unnaturally so that you can make an Overload version of it doesn't strike me as a good way to approach the game, and I recommend against it. You can hypothetically make creatures with Overload now, but if you were going to do that, I'd recommend you make them so they clean themselves up. Like, if you overload them, they die somehow. There are ways to do that. Dredge. Sigh. Alright, so the guild identity here is amazing. This is perfect. This is a sewer steadily filling up, and as it bobs along, you see more and more things that you recognize that you can connect to. Dredge is such an amazing mechanic for the Golgari, and it kind of set the tone and also broke the game in multiple formats. And the funny thing is, impact-wise, when you set aside not caring about what the Dredge cards do, there's kind of one good Dredge card, and it's Life from the Loam. Which was, don't get me wrong, I'm perfectly willing to hear that Life from the Loam was too good, especially when we had cycling lands in Standard. If we did, I don't know. But the thing is, we've got a card since then with Dredge 1. And Dredge 1 is terrible. People don't play Dredge 1. So Dredge has clearly got a sweet spot for the kinds of effects you can get and the kinds of things you can do with it. But because Dredge is now a poisoned well, we have to be very careful with ever printing more Dredge cards, which is a real bummer because this is such a perfect mechanic for the Golgari. You can ironically make pretty much anything into a Dredge spell, and the question is just like, how bad does the Dredge value have to be? Making a card that, for example, exiles graveyards and give that Dredge, I reckon you could get that played in Legacy. Jumpstart! Again, the Izzet are meant to be artificers, and this is extra frustrating because a Jumpstart is a thing you do to machines, and this effect is just casting spells from your graveyard. Slightly crap flashback. Oh well. The impact of Jumpstart is good, but only generically so. You don't necessarily want a lot of Jumpstart cards, but they do feed into each other. You can discard a Jumpstart card to get another Jumpstart card, but that doesn't get you a discount or anything. It just, lets you keep cards moving from space to space, which I understand Mike Flores refers to as velocity, and that feels good. The problem with a lot of Jumpstart is that wound up being glue for other decks that wanted to, for example, cast multiple spells, or wanted to, say, get stuff in your graveyard to start dredging. So that's probably a sign of a problem. Breathwise, you can make every good spell a Jumpstart spell, and they will just be generically good spells. It's way too wide, and it doesn't fit the Izzet's fundamental idea of being artificers at all. Real embarrassing in hindsight. Scavenge. Oh no, I'm also going to be embarrassed here because I like Scavenge. I think its guild identity is pretty much perfect. The way that you take an existing creature and reduce it to just the simplest expression of what it is, just power and toughness, and then be able to use that after it's died, that's perfect. I love that. Impact-wise, it's a bit hard to say because I don't think we ever got a good Scavenge card. The closest you can say is Varol's. But again, if Varol's ability was just a activated ability of Varol's, then that's covered. Scavenge is an effect where there's room to explore it, and there's room to do, for example, triggered effects, like when this is exiled, or when this enters or is scavenged. You can make scavenged creatures more interesting. We even have creature tokens, we even have keyword counters as well, so you can have, hypothetically, like a trample creature that when you scavenge it also puts a trample counter on something. That would be cool, but it's not a effect that people like. I think that it's been poisoned because the first time we saw Scavenge, it sucked. And we're not going to give it 20 years to bring it back because it's not exciting. People aren't pining for its return like they were with Storm. Afterlife. Guild identity. This is just a generic black-white effect. It's not really an Ortsov effect beyond the fact that the Ortsov care about ghosts. Impact-wise, it's a small refund on a creature. It's useful in sacrifice-based decks. You would have decks that would run mediocre creatures with Afterlife just because they had Afterlife, because they cared about the 2 bodies, not because they cared about specifically getting a flyer. That's usually a bad sign. The fact that you can have a flying creature and it doesn't matter that it's a flying creature, that's a problem. Breadth-wise, this is a mechanic that you'll see everywhere. Again, in Foundations, we got Infestation Sage. This is such a generic effect that we get it everywhere else. Real bit of a miss here. Battalion. Guild identity. It wants the Boros Legion on the battlefield, it wants there to be multiples of you on the battlefield, and it wants you to attack. This is just great. This is just a plain out great effect. Impact-wise, it's cool and good, especially because if you have 1 creature with Battalion and 2 other creatures, great, your Battalion creature fires. But the immediate thought is, what if I had 3 creatures with a Battalion? What if every creature in my deck had Battalion? So it's encouraging you to be more Boros. Breadth-wise, it's surprisingly a little limited. You can't make too many creatures that look for 3 or more, because without that, then you wind up with decks that either too easily get to 3 creatures and therefore they are just always on, or you make the cards dull by comparison when they don't have anything going on. You don't run a Boros Elite because you want a 1/1 for 1 in your deck. That's not anything that's super exciting. Mentor. The guild identity of Mentor is really strong. The Boros Legion want to fight, and they reward fighting with improvement in skills, but the improvement in skills brings with it a danger. You put yourself in danger. You can watch your mentor die because they went into battle to teach you. That's really cool. There's a lot going on with that mechanic. The impact for it is kind of perfectly tuned in my opinion, because you have to be modestly clever, but it's not a brain burner. You have to work out when it's safe to attack, and when it's safe to attack will be including a +1/+1 counter, which will trip people up, but if you get it right, it feels great. Breadth-wise, it's also really cleverly structured, because every mentor creature has a limit on how big it can get based on what's coming after it. You could hypothetically curve out mentor creatures all the way after like a generic 1/1, but they can't keep staggering up immediately. There needs to be a breather for every round of it. And it looks like you can use Mentor for lots of things, and then when you start mucking around with it, you realize that it's surprisingly tight. The space for Mentor to be good is very specific. I like it a lot. Detain. Speaking of liking it a lot, I love Detain. It's a really good mechanic, and it's a great expression that the Azorius have a power structure. The Azorius does not make a creature pacifist. It does not affect the creature. The rules say that creature is currently occupied because of the rules. I love that. It has a lack of counterplay, which is why it's got to be single turn based. It is a weird timing based thing as well. Like, there aren't a lot of things that say until your next turn on common creatures at this point. But I think the impact of Detain feels so good, but the best thing about it is tied to the power that they used for it. They didn't make a lot of things that could detain repeatedly, and the things that could detain repeatedly couldn't do it very cheaply. So instead, what you got was this desire to detain, play a creature that did another detain, play another creature that did another detain, and all these detains are effectively locking down the biggest thing. You're putting your opponent on the back foot and applying more pressure, but every person who's putting people under arrest is still calling back and going, hey, get more, get more. Really cool. And you couldn't use like a single detain creature in your deck as like, yes, this is my detain effect, unless you had some way of like reusing it or whatnot. So that created a different puzzle. Mostly, you would want lots of detain if you had any. Breadth-wise, this is kind of perfectly sized for a Ravnica set. This has maybe 10-ish cards worth of space for it. You could keep making more of it, but they would get very generic and similar feeling very quickly. If you made a lot more detain cards, or made them more reliable, or made them more control powered, you'd lose the pressure effect that makes it feel like police coming in for a sweep. Spectacle. Guild identity, perfect, no notes. If it had a more generic name, it wouldn't tie into the Rakdos, so by naming it Spectacle, it's perfect for them. Impact-wise, not only is Spectacle good feeling to use, when you hit an opponent, there is this window of time where they're going, oh no, do they have a Spectacle card? That's exciting. It is literally putting on a show. Not the bang, but the anticipation thereof. Breadth, as an alternate cost, you can make an infinite number of spectacle cards, but you can't just port them randomly to other settings with the name Spectacle. Which means that when we go back to Ravnica and we see this mechanic again, odds are really good it's going to be just tied to effects that do Rakdos-y things. I like that a lot. Riot. Guild identity. Kind of perfect. Do you want haste or do you want size? These are two things you want. You have to pick one. And while the nature of the green-red mage in my life is her response would be, I want both, the fact is making a player make an interesting choice is really cool. The impact of it is great. If you have Riot, it's good. If you have a lot of Riot, it gives you a lot of flexibility. It would be better if every Riot card made some reason for you to want more Riot cards, but, you know, this is the Gruul. They want you to be applying pressure. That's kind of okay. It is unfortunately a bit broad. You could probably put Riot cards in a lot of other colors overall. The thing is, Riot is a term that probably doesn't fit in green in most settings, but also in Mercadian Masks, we had a faction of white rebels. You could have a riot being run by white characters in... Well, you could have rioting white people. That's a hell of a phrase. You could have riot on white creatures in a set like that. It could have been a Boros mechanic, well, a red-white mechanic in another set, chosen well. It's a lot like Spectacle in that the name of it is what holds it in place. I like it. Bloodthirst. The guild identity here is good, but not great. There's a reason they brought it back for vampires in M12. This is a mechanic that we see get used just often enough that it doesn't fall out of the mind, but it is very much generically a good effect. You hit your opponent, this thing gets more counters. Impact-wise, it is interesting for deck building because you want things that will enable it, but you also don't want things that are worthless in the late game in your beefy hit you deck. You could go with pump spells or ways to force through damage like trample on spell effects, but that is itself a thing that dilutes from just the things that are beefy and hit you. It encourages a mix and it encourages commonality. That's alright. Breadth, it's a mechanic that's been revisited twice and made as a guest star in a recent set. There's a fair bit you can do with it. It's a little too broad for a guild mechanic. But, you know. Blood Rush. The guild identity here is good, but not amazing. Lots of red-green decks in a lot of red-green places care about attacking. The name is very generic. The fact that it's an ability word means that you could put this literally anywhere. The impact of it is it feels great. It's a way to put creature pump in a deck without diluting the number of creatures you have, but also because those creatures can be sized a bit bigger, it means that you aren't playing necessarily a deck that's like, 16 Scrib Sprites and 16 Giant Growths. You are actually playing with things that are a little bit cumbersome in the hand, but also if you discard them to use Blood Rush, you might find yourself going, dang it, I should have hung on to that. The game is going to go longer than I thought it was. It also makes generically simple bodies like big tramplers pretty good. The breadth is... It's challenging to make a lot of Blood Rush because secretly, every Blood Rush creature should have a different size so that it's not just the same effect every time. You won't wind up with someone who's just using them for a whole bunch of +3/+3s. But you also don't want them to be too similar. And a +1/+2 versus a +1/+3 versus a +1/+4. Is that really a bigger difference? And you don't want that kind of thing to be too varied. We might have literally seen all the Blood Rush creatures that can exist until they give us a Blood Rush Tarmogoyf reference. Man, I talk a lot of smack about how the Gruul handles the story element and the language of the world around them, but the three mechanics they've had have been pretty solid for all that I might complain. Populate. Guild identity-wise, this is peerless. Populate is the have more, get more effect, which is the whole point of Selesnya. Bonus, thanks to Selesnya getting access to Bloomburrow's Offspring cards, it's proof that the Selesnya bang a lot. Impact-wise, it gives you everything you want, and it makes you hesitate on whether you're getting the best effect out of it. Rootborn Defenses is a common that just makes something indestructible and populates, and it is in 3% of all white commander decks on EDH Rec. That's ludicrous. In 3% of decks... That's such a niche effect, and yet so many people want it, just in case it's good. Breadth. We keep getting it, and oh look, it escapes the Selesnya and starts showing up in every color, and here is the problem of Populate. Selesnya have a mechanic that's just generically good, and it's generically flavored, and because it's a good keyword action, it covers a lot of comprehensive rules text that would be used to otherwise specify space on the cards, which means we can shrink that down and then make a bazillion cards with it, and it does a good job that a lot of cards want. We're going to wind up seeing that problem crop up again. Evolve! The guild identity here is surprisingly good. Impact-wise, Evolve is a kind of pseudo-haste, and it encourages you to keep putting things on the board, so you get a very material kind of existence, like the Simic are, a culture of stuff. But you will eventually run out of that extension, and it means that some cards will get bad when you start to rebuild. Evolve is a mechanic that touches on the edges of how the Simic feel, especially in that it winds up with kind of sleepy starts for these creatures. You get these weird lopsided shapes that then get better and better as they just get more and more powerful. It works out, in my opinion, really well. We do get more Evolve cards from time to time, but they do stick in blue and green, and they do seem to stick with the Simic flavor. So I think Evolve is pretty strong on that front. And now we get to the point where this whole thing spikes. Convoke. The guild identity of Convoke in Selesnya is strong. When you are in Ravnica, if you see a Convoke spell, you know it's a Selesnya spell because they've done it twice. Convoke is, in Ravnica, a Selesnya effect. The impact of Convoke is fantastic. Convoke cards encourage you to have more Convoke cards. Convoke cards enable more Convoke cards. Its breadth is overwhelming. Convoke has shown up in a core set. Convoke has shown up in every color at this point, I think. Convoke has shown up on artifacts. Convoke is a simply too good, too broad mechanic to be a guild mechanic. Part of the problem with Convoke being revisited twice for the Selesnya and being everywhere for everyone now is that it means that Convoke is not this interesting little pocket of mechanics that one guild got one time that you can use when they have a niche application. And now it's just a good effect that this color gets. Complicating that then is if you go back to those old cards, for the most part, most Convoke cards are bad. Most of the old ones just aren't good because they were made at a time when cards were in general weaker. That's not true for a lot of these effects. Because we're only ever going to see them, these are as good as they get. And so if you play with them, you're going to have to play with them on their level. Alas, by putting these old cards and these new cards in direct competition, Convoke's new cards tend to be better than Convoke's old cards. But Court of Calling still makes me fantastically happy. Surveil. And here is the true diamond of the guild mechanics. Its guild identity is piss poor. Like, it's an existing effect that every color already got access to. You can tell because they've gone back and made anytime Surveil effects happen, Surveil effects. So you can find Surveil that predates the set it was printed in. Surveil is a keyword action now on the par of Scry. It's just something we're going to see all the time. It feels great. It always feels great to use. It doesn't particularly tie into being a spy or assassin. It can tie into being a large monkey if you want it to. As far as its breadth goes, it's way too huge, which is why it escaped the guild and wound up becoming a keyword mechanic that everyone uses, even back in time. Surveil is an amazing mechanic. I'm glad we have it. It's just real rough on the poor Dimir that one of their mechanics wound up being given to everyone, as it were. Now, for all of this stuff, all of this talk about these cards, you need to remember, this kind of talk about how I think these mechanics should be deployed, and whatever mechanical insight I offer, this is a purism that Magic, as a business, does not have and does not need. Wizards are going to mine the resources they have and keep the game going, and the game is a hungry beast. The kind of revisionism that I'm proposing, the kind of vision that we need to use these mechanics well the first time we use them and that's it, that's the kind of revisionism that only amateur designers get to do. It is the purest form of custom Magic making, of sitting on the sidelines and going, here's how I do it better or differently to Wizards, because I have a personal beef that I guess Radiance should be replaced with something cool.